She crossed 2,000 miles on the word of a man she'd never met, and arrived to find him already married to someone else, laughing about it over whiskey, while half the town watched her stand in the dirt with one suitcase and nowhere left to go. 56 years old, broke, publicly humiliated in front of strangers. Most women would have crumbled right there on that dusty Montana street. Margaret Holloway didn't crumble. What she built from that moment of total ruin would eventually make the entire territory remember her name. Stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The stagecoach hit a rut so hard that Margaret Holloway's head cracked against the wooden frame beside her, and she didn't even flinch. She had stopped flinching at pain somewhere around Nebraska. She pressed 2 fingers to her temple, felt the dull throb bloom beneath her skin, and turned back to the window. Outside, Montana stretched itself open in every direction, wide and golden and indifferent, the kind of landscape that didn't care whether you survived it or not. Sage and dry grass, pale sky pressing down on brown hills. A hawk riding a thermal so high it looked like a punctuation mark against the clouds. Margaret had never seen this much open space in her life. She wasn't sure yet whether it frightened her or steadied her. Both, maybe. Both at the same time. She was 56 years old, and she was starting over. That was the simple truth of it, stripped of all the softer words she might have used to explain the situation to someone else. The explanation she'd given the woman who'd sat beside her for the first 3 days, a young schoolteacher heading to Missoula, had been trimmed and tidied into something almost respectable. I answered an advertisement. A merchant in Caldwell Creek is seeking a housekeeper. Mature, capable woman preferred. Room and board provided, with consideration for longer arrangement. The younger woman had nodded approvingly and said it sounded like a fine opportunity. She hadn't asked why a woman Margaret's age was crossing the country alone. People rarely asked the questions that mattered. The longer truth was harder to carry, so Margaret had learned to set it down for stretches at a time. She would pick it back up at night, in the rocking dark of the coach, when there was nothing to look at and no one to perform composure for. She would pick it up and hold it and feel the full weight of it, and then she would put it back down again before morning. Her husband, Robert, had been sick for 11 years. 11 years of doctor visits and pharmacy accounts, and the particular grinding exhaustion of watching someone you love slowly become someone you barely recognize. She had given those years without complaint because that was what you did, and because she had loved him once, genuinely, in the way young people love before life teaches them that love alone doesn't insulate you from anything. Robert died on a Thursday morning in February, in the room where they'd slept for 23 years, with morning light coming through the curtains she'd sewn herself. She had held his hand until it went still. She had sat there for a long time afterward. And then their son, Thomas, had arrived. Thomas was 31, tall, with Robert's jaw and none of Robert's decency. He had stood in the doorway of that bedroom and looked at his father's still form and then at his mother, and she had watched something move through his face. Not grief exactly, more like calculation, the expression of a man running numbers. "There are things we need to discuss," he'd said. The house was sold within 6 weeks. Margaret had known the house technically belonged to Thomas. Robert had signed it that way years earlier, some legal arrangement she hadn't fully understood at the time and hadn't thought to question. She'd had no reason to question it then. She hadn't imagined she would need to. Thomas had given her $40 and told her he couldn't afford to maintain 2 households. She'd looked at him for a long time. He'd looked back without blinking. "You're my mother," she'd finally said. "I know that," he'd answered, "but you're also able-bodied and capable. You'll find something." She found the advertisement 3 weeks later, folded into the back pages of a Philadelphia paper she'd been using to wrap her remaining china before moving into a single rented room. Mature woman of steady character sought for domestic management of prosperous frontier household. Merchant of good standing requires experienced housekeeper and eventual companion. Correspondence invited. All arrangements honored upon arrival. The word companion had done most of the work. She wasn't young enough to be naive about what it meant. A man advertising for a companion on the frontier was a man who was lonely, who had built something and had nobody to share it with. She understood that. She was 56, not 16. She wasn't expecting romance. She was expecting something honest. a working arrangement between two adults past the age of pretending, something built on actual need rather than the performance of it. She had written the letter. Harold Fitch had written back. His handwriting was careful and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who hadn't written many letters and wanted this one to count. He described his mercantile business in Caldwell Creek. He described the frontier honestly. Cold winters, hard work, no place for the faint of heart. And she'd appreciated that more than flattery. He said he needed someone practical and unafraid. He said he believed in keeping his word. "I will be at the stage stop when you arrive," he had written. "You have my word on it." She had believed him. That perhaps had been her mistake. The stagecoach rolled into Caldwell Creek at 2:30 in the afternoon. Margaret had tidied herself during the last hour of travel, brushed the dust from her dress, repinned her gray hair, straightened her back against the rocking seat. She was not a vain woman, but she understood the importance of a first impression, and she wanted to arrive looking like someone worth keeping a promise for. The town was bigger than she'd imagined. A main street of maybe 30 buildings, some of them 2 stories, a few with fresh paint. A blacksmith, 2 saloons, a dry goods store with a hand-lettered sign, a small bank. People moved on the boardwalks, going about their afternoon business. Horses tied to rails switched flies from their flanks. The smell of the place hit her first. Horses and sawdust and something frying somewhere, and the faint mineral tang of coming rain. She stepped down from the coach and stood on the street and looked for Harold Fitch. She had no photograph of him. She knew only that he was 53, brown-haired, and ran the mercantile on Main Street. She had assumed that wouldn't matter because he would find her. The stranger just stepped off the coach with one suitcase and the unmistakable look of someone who had traveled very far. There was no one waiting. She stood beside her suitcase for several minutes, watching the other passengers disperse. The driver climbed back up without looking at her. A small crowd had gathered near the front of the mercantile across the street, people laughing about something, voices carrying in the dry air. She crossed toward it. The mercantile door was propped open. Through the gathering of people on the boardwalk, she could see a heavy-set man behind the counter, red-faced and grinning, clearly the center of whatever story was being told. A young woman stood close beside him, barely 25, Margaret guessed, wearing a dress that cost more than anything in Margaret's suitcase. A man at the edge of the crowd noticed Margaret approaching. Something shifted in his expression. He stepped back slightly, and the movement caught someone else's attention, and then heads began to turn, and the laughter died in pieces, replaced by a silence that felt worse than anything that had come before it. The heavy-set man looked up. He had brown hair, going gray at the temples. He was 53 years old. Harold Fitch looked at Margaret Holloway for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to understand who she was. And then he looked away, toward the young woman beside him, and something moved through his face that Margaret recognized immediately because she had seen it on Thomas's face 6 weeks ago. Calculation. "Mrs. Holloway." The voice came from a shorter man beside Fitch, a lean, weathered man in a wool vest who was very carefully not meeting her eyes. "I'm Bernard Coyle, Harold's business partner." "Where is Mr. Fitch?" she said. Coyle cleared his throat. Around them, no one moved. "Harold was married," Coyle said, 3 weeks ago, to Mrs. Clara Webb." Margaret stood very still. "He's been meaning to write," Coyle continued, the words falling out faster now, like he was trying to get to the end of something unpleasant as quickly as possible. "With everything that happened, the wedding and getting the house in order, there just wasn't time." "There wasn't time," Margaret repeated. Her voice came out flat and even. Not because she was calm, because she was 56 years old and she had learned long ago that the moments that break you open are the ones you survive by going absolutely still, like an animal in the grass when it hears something it cannot yet see. "I'm afraid the arrangement is no longer—" Coyle started. "Yes," she said. "I understand what the arrangement no longer is." There was a sound from somewhere in the crowd, low, brief, somewhere between a laugh and a murmur. She didn't look to find out who made it. She kept her eyes on Coyle, because looking at Coyle meant she didn't have to look at Fitch, who was still standing at the counter, still not looking at her, his new wife's hand resting on his forearm like punctuation. "There's a boarding house," Coyle said. "Mrs. Alderman's on the East End. I know what a boarding house is," Margaret said. She picked up her suitcase. She turned around. She walked back across the street in the September afternoon, back straight, steps measured, and she did not let herself feel anything. Not the humiliation coiling through her chest, not the heat rising in her face, not the very specific horror of being publicly discarded for the second time in less than 2 months. Because if she felt any of it right now, on this street, in front of these people, she would come apart. And she had promised herself years ago that she would not come apart where anyone could see her do it. She heard the murmuring start up again behind her. Somebody laughed. She kept walking. The voice came from her left, calm and unhurried, the way someone speaks when they're not trying to impress anyone. That was a poor way to treat a person. She stopped. He was still on his horse, a tall bay that stood motionless despite the noise of the street. The man himself was somewhere in his late 30s, lean and broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had spent too many years in the weather to look like much of anything except honest. He was watching her without pity, which was the first thing she noticed. No sympathy face, no head tilted to one side the way people do when they're preparing to condescend. Just a man looking at another person. "Yes," she said. "It was. You came a long way. Nearly 2,000 miles. He nodded slowly, like that was a piece of information he was actually absorbing rather than just acknowledging. He looked across the street toward the mercantile, then back at her. "My name's Colton Hayes," he said. "I run a cattle ranch about 4 miles out, Silver Creek. I'm in town most Wednesdays for supplies." He paused. "I don't generally make offers like this one." "What offer is that?" "Come see the ranch before you decide this territory is not worth your time." He said it without elaboration. No sales pitch attached. "If nothing else, it's 4 miles away from those people." She studied him. In her experience, men who offered things without naming the price were more dangerous than the ones who named it up front. She had been fool enough to believe printed words in a newspaper. She was not about to compound the mistake by following a stranger on horseback into the Montana wilderness because he had a steady voice and direct eyes. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "You don't." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small coin purse, which he held out toward her. She didn't take it. "What is that?" "Week's stay at Mrs. Alderman's boarding house." He set it on top of her suitcase when she didn't reach for it. "The offer stands whether you use it or not. Wednesday next, if you want to come see the place, I'll be here at the feed store at 9 in the morning." He said it the way a man states a fact about the weather. Simple, without investment in her response. Then he turned the bay horse and rode down the street and didn't look back. Margaret stood on the boardwalk holding her suitcase, the coin purse balanced on top of it, and watched him go. Around her, the afternoon continued its ordinary business. A woman came out of the dry goods store and nearly walked into her. 2 boys chased a dog past the barber's. She looked down at the coin purse. She thought about Thomas, who had given her $40, and the particular look of a man doing arithmetic. She thought about Harold Fitch, who hadn't been able to make himself look at her. She thought about the 11 years she had spent caring for a man while the world continued without her, and the long coach ride across a country that hadn't asked whether she was ready, and the 56 years she had spent being practical and steady and capable, and how none of it, not one careful, disciplined year of it, had turned out to be enough to keep her from standing on a dirt street in Montana with 1 suitcase and nowhere to sleep. She picked up the coin purse. She walked to Mrs. Alderman's boarding house. That night, alone in a room the size of a ship's cabin, with the sound of the wind moving through the eaves and the distant noise of one of the saloons carrying through the thin walls, Margaret Holloway sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, finally, to feel every single thing she'd been holding back since she stepped off that coach. It took a long time. When it was done, she washed her face in the basin on the small table, looked at her reflection in the spotted mirror above it, and made herself a promise. "One more time," she told herself, "one more time, and if it comes to nothing, then at least you'll know you tried." She had no idea yet what Silver Creek Ranch looked like. She had no idea what it meant that a quiet man had paid for her lodging and ridden away without asking for a single thing. She had no idea that the following Wednesday morning would be the beginning of the only life she had ever actually chosen for herself. She only knew she was still here. That would have to be enough for tonight. The Wednesday morning arrived gray and cold with a low sky that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain or simply threatened to. Margaret had been awake since before dawn. Not from nerves exactly, but from the particular restlessness that comes when you've made a decision and your body knows it, before your mind has finished arguing. She had spent 6 days at Mrs. Alderman's boarding house. 6 days of adequate meals and thin walls, and the careful politeness of a landlady who had clearly heard about the stagecoach incident and was waiting to see what Margaret would do next. The other boarders were polite in the distant way of people who didn't want to get attached to someone who might be gone by the weekend. She didn't blame them. She understood the instinct. She had spent those 6 days being careful. She walked through town, learned its layout, observed who ran what and who talked to whom. She went into the dry goods store twice, not to buy anything substantial, but to listen. She sat in the small dining room at breakfast and kept her mouth shut and her ears open, the way Robert had always said she never did, which was unfair, because she had always listened. She'd simply learned early that people rarely said the most important things out loud. She heard about Colton Hayes in pieces. He'd come to Montana from Missouri when he was 19, following a cattle drive that ended and simply never went home. He'd filed on a land claim at 22 and spent the next decade building it by hand, mostly alone, occasionally with seasonal help. He paid fairly and treated decently, which people in Caldwell Creek mentioned as though it were unusual rather than basic. His parents had died in a bad winter when he was 24, both of them within a week of each other. He'd never married. People offered various theories about why, none of them particularly charitable. "Particular man," Mrs. Alderman said one morning, refilling Margaret's coffee without being asked. She said it neutrally, neither approving nor condemning. "Knows what he wants. Doesn't pretend otherwise." "Is that a warning?" Margaret asked. The landlady considered. "More of a description." She set the coffee pot down. "He's a fair man, I'll say that. Can't always say that about men out here." It wasn't much to go on, but it was something. She was standing in front of the feed store at 5 minutes before 9, her coat buttoned to the collar, when Colton Hayes rode up on the same bay horse. He didn't seem surprised to see her, but she noticed that something in his posture settled slightly. A small, unconscious release of tension she wouldn't have caught if she hadn't been watching carefully. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. "Mr. Hayes." He tied the horse and brought around a second one from the rail beside the store, a smaller roan mare, saddled and waiting. She looked at the horse, then at him. "I'm not certain I'm coming," she said. "I said I'd come see. I reserve the right to look and leave." "Fair enough," he said, handing her the reins. She hadn't been on a horse in 11 years. She managed the mount without asking for help, though it took an ungraceful moment that she chose to ignore and he politely didn't comment on. They rode out of town side by side, the morning air cold enough to see breath, the road north cutting through rolling grass still gold and dry from summer. He didn't talk much, which she found she didn't mind. After 11 years of a sick room and then 2 months of people telling her what she should do next, the quiet felt like something she could actually breathe inside. After a while, she said, "Why did you offer? In town? You don't know me any better than I know you." He thought about it for a moment. Not the way people do when they're deciding what to say, but the way people do when they're actually deciding what they think. "I've seen men humiliate women in public before," he said, "usually because they can and there's no cost to it. It bothered me. And you looked—" He paused. "You didn't look broken. You looked angry. There's a difference." She hadn't expected that. "I was both," she said. "I know, but you walked straight. That means something out here." She didn't answer. They rode on. Silver Creek Ranch announced itself gradually. First the fence line, stretching away in both directions further than she expected, the posts set straight and solid. Then the cattle, more of them than she'd imagined from what she'd heard, grazing on hillsides that still held some green despite the season. Then the outbuildings, a barn that was genuinely large, a separate bunkhouse, a smokehouse, a root cellar built into the hillside with a heavy door, a kitchen garden, mostly harvested, but with winter squash still sitting on the ground like orange stones. And then the house. Wasn't what she'd been prepared for. She'd been prepared for a cabin, the kind of rough-built shelter that sufficed without aspiring to anything more. What she saw instead was a house, a real one, with a covered porch along the front, glass windows, a stone chimney wide enough to mean a fireplace worth sitting in front of. 2 stories. Built from timber and stone, and clearly built by someone who intended to stay. "You built this," she said. It wasn't a question. Most of it. Hired help for the stone chimney. I'm better with wood than rock. She stood in the yard and looked at it for a moment, and she was aware of something shifting in her, some mental category she'd put him in already adjusting itself without her permission. Come in, he said. I'll show you the place. Then you can decide. The inside was spare, but not uncomfortable. A main room with the fireplace, a kitchen that was organized in the pragmatic way of someone who cooked alone and had stopped fighting that fact. A table with 4 chairs, though she suspected only one of them had been used regularly in years. The floors were plain wood, swept clean. A shelf of books along one wall, fewer than she'd expected, more than most men on the frontier owned. She noticed a well-worn almanac, 2 volumes on cattle management, a collection of Shakespeare that looked genuinely read rather than displayed. He showed her the second floor. 2 bedrooms, both with beds, one clearly his and one clearly not used for anything except storage of boxes and a spare saddle. He showed her the kitchen larder, the root cellar out back, the spring house down the slope where the creek ran cold year-round. He showed her the barn and introduced her to 2 of the ranch hands, a quiet young man named Eli and an older stocky man named Hector, who had an accent she couldn't quite place and a way of assessing her that was frank without being rude. She's the one from the stage? Hector asked Colton. She is, Colton said. Hector looked at her another moment. Then he nodded, once, as though she'd passed something, and went back to mending a harness. They ate lunch at the kitchen table, bread, cold beans, coffee that was stronger than anything she'd had at the boarding house. He explained what he was proposing, plainly and without embellishment. She would manage the household and the supply accounts. She would have the second bedroom, her own use of the kitchen, a small salary paid monthly. If the arrangement suited both of them after 3 months, they would discuss extending it. He wasn't offering charity, he said. He was offering work, because the work existed and she was capable of doing it. I've been running this ranch alone for 15 years, he said. I'm good at cattle. I'm bad at accounts. The records are a mess, and I know it, and it costs me money I don't have to throw away. How bad? She asked. Bad enough that I overpaid a supplier by $60 last year and didn't catch it until he was gone. She set her coffee cup down. Show me the books. He looked at her. Right now, he said, you want to know if I can do the work. So do I. Show me the books. He got them from the desk in the corner, a ledger that was thick and coffee-stained and written in 3 different handwriting styles, which told her immediately that it had been kept inconsistently by different people over different periods. She opened it and began reading, and within 10 minutes she had found 2 additional errors beyond the supplier overpayment, one of which had been compounding for 8 months. When she looked up, Colton was watching her from across the table. $112, she said. That's what these errors cost you in the past year alone. Possibly more. I'd need to go back further to know for certain. The silence lasted several seconds. All right, he said quietly. What would you need to fix it? Time and a clean ledger, and whoever made these entries in the middle section needs to be told to leave the accounts alone. That was me, he said. Then you need to leave the accounts alone. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close. When can you start? He said. She thought about the small room at Mrs. Alderman's. She thought about the 6 days of careful observation and thin walls and polite distance. She thought about what she knew of this man, which was not a great deal, and what she knew of herself, which was more than she'd given herself credit for. I'll need to retrieve my things from the boarding house, she said, and I want it understood clearly. This is a working arrangement. I manage the household and the accounts. Nothing else is implied or offered. Nothing else is asked, he said, without flinching. Without the small, involuntary flicker of something injured that men sometimes produced when they felt their intentions had been questioned. Just a plain statement, returned the same way she'd given hers. She nodded. Then I'll start Monday, she said. She started Monday. The first week was harder than she'd anticipated, and she'd anticipated hard. The accounts were worse than her initial scan had suggested. Not through dishonesty, but through years of a busy man recording things quickly and imprecisely, trusting his memory where he should have trusted the page. She spent the first 3 days at that kitchen table reconstructing the supply ledger from receipts Colton had kept in a box under the desk, which was both disorganized and fortunate, since without them she couldn't have rebuilt the record at all. She also discovered that the food storage was haphazard, in ways that cost money and risked waste. Bulk flour stored where moisture got to it. Smoked meat hung too close together. The root cellar organized by no particular logic so that older vegetables were buried behind newer ones and rotted before anyone reached them. She reorganized it systematically over 2 evenings. Colton walked in on the second evening to find the entire root cellar contents laid out on boards she'd borrowed from the barn, sorted by type and age. He stood in the doorway and looked at it. "I was going to do that," he said. "Were you?" she said, in the flat tone that indicated she already knew the answer. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, quietly suppressed, and left her to it. She was not comfortable. Not yet. She was in an unfamiliar place with an unfamiliar man and unfamiliar rhythms, and there were moments at night when the remoteness of the ranch pressed in and she lay awake listening to sounds she couldn't identify and felt the full weight of how alone she actually was. No one in the world except this man and his 2 ranch hands knew exactly where she was. Thomas certainly didn't know and wouldn't have cared. There was no one she could have telegraphed if something went wrong. She told herself on those nights that she had survived 11 years of Robert's illness and 2 months of being discarded like unwanted furniture, and that this cold room in a solid house with actual work to do was not the worst thing she had ever faced. And that helped, mostly. Colton was not easy to know. He was present without being intrusive. She would hear him in the mornings before she was up, the sounds of early chores, the barn door, the horses. He ate breakfast at the table while she drank her coffee and worked on the accounts, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't, and neither seemed to require the other to fill the silence. He answered questions directly and didn't ask many of his own, though she noticed he listened carefully when she spoke, with the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who grew up mostly alone and learned that what others say is worth hearing. What she noticed about him gradually over those first weeks was this: he was fair. Not sentimental, not soft. The frontier had not produced a soft man, and the frontier didn't tolerate them long if it did, but fair. When Eli made a mistake that cost them a fence section and half a day's work, Colton explained what went wrong and how to prevent it, without raising his voice or extracting any pound of flesh. When a neighboring rancher came by to dispute a property boundary, Colton listened to the whole argument before responding, and his response was measured and accurate and ultimately resolved the dispute without requiring anyone to back down visibly. She found herself watching him sometimes, the way you watch something you're still deciding about. Then the town started. She'd known it would happen. She'd seen the way people looked when Colton brought her back to retrieve her things from Mrs. Alderman's, the way information moved through a frontier town, fast and embellished and rarely corrected once it settled into the shape people preferred. By the second week, she was aware, through the careful social architecture of small-town life, that the stories had begun circulating. Colton heard about them before she did. He came home from town one Wednesday looking slightly tighter around the jaw than usual, and she asked him directly what was being said. He set his coat on the hook by the door. "That you're waiting for me to die so you can take the ranch." She looked at him. "Also," he added, with the reluctant honesty of someone reporting bad news completely, "that no sane woman your age would come this far unless she was hiding something." "And what do you think?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "I think you reorganized my root cellar and found $112 I didn't know I'd lost. I think I'm not particularly interested in what people who've never run a ranch in their lives think about how I run mine." She nodded once. "Good." But the town wasn't done. The incident at Henderson's General Store happened on a Thursday afternoon when she'd ridden in with Colton to pick up supply orders. Clara Fitch, formerly Clara Webb, now wearing Harold Fitch's name and a dress that had probably cost more than Margaret's entire wardrobe, was there with 2 other women, purchasing fabric. Margaret had been aware of her the moment she walked in. She had taken a careful inventory of her own feelings on the subject and concluded that she bore the woman no particular ill will. Clara Fitch hadn't advertised in a Philadelphia newspaper and made a promise she didn't keep. That was Harold's piece of the disaster, not hers. But Clara Fitch, it turned out, had heard the stories too. And Clara Fitch had a certain kind of confidence that comes from being young and pretty and recently married to a man with money. The confidence of someone who has never had occasion to find out what she's actually made of. She approached Margaret near the fabric bolts, her 2 companions a half step behind her in the way of supporting cast. "Mrs. Holloway," she said pleasantly. Too pleasantly. The kind of pleasant that has a different intention underneath it. I was just saying to Harold the other day, if you find that ranch life doesn't suit you, I'm sure we could find you a comfortable position. We need someone to manage the household. Someone capable and, a small pause, delicate as a needle, settled. It would be much more suitable than your current situation, I think. The store had gone quiet in the specific way that frontier stores went quiet when something worth talking about later was happening. Margaret turned to face her fully. She looked at Clara Fitch, young, composed, waiting with the small smile of someone who expects to win. And she thought about what it meant that this woman considered a housemaid's position an appropriate offer to make to someone standing in her husband's store. She thought about what it meant that the word suitable had been deployed so carefully, aimed at the gap between Margaret's age and where she now stood. She could feel the attention of everyone in the store. She said quietly and without hurry, "That's a kind offer, but I've already found something your house can't give me." Clara waited. "And what is that?" "Respect." Margaret held her eyes. "Not the kind that gets offered when people are watching, the kind that's there when no one is." She turned back to the supply list in her hands. The silence in the store lasted longer than comfortable. Clara Fitch left shortly after, her two companions close behind her, and if any of the remaining customers caught Margaret's eye, she didn't acknowledge it. She finished reviewing the list and brought it to the counter and did not revisit the exchange in her head, or at least not there in the store. She revisited it that night, alone in her room, in the honest dark, where she allowed herself to be tired and frightened and uncertain in ways she didn't show anyone. Because the truth was, for all the steadiness she'd performed in that store, she didn't know yet whether she had actually found what she'd told Clara Fitch she'd found. She knew Colton was fair. She knew the work was real and the problems were solvable and the accounts were already in better shape than they'd been in years. But she was still sleeping in a borrowed room on a stranger's ranch, with the whole territory watching, waiting to see whether she'd fail or flee or prove every whispered theory right. She was 56 years old. She was tired in her bones in a way she suspected had very little to do with the work. And she was still here. Outside, the Montana sky pressed down enormous and cold, the kind of sky that made Philadelphia feel like something she'd read in a book rather than lived in. The wind moved through the grass with a sound like breathing. In the barn below, one of the horses shifted and stamped and went quiet again. She turned over in the borrowed bed in the borrowed room of a life she hadn't chosen yet, but hadn't refused either, and she told herself the same thing she'd been telling herself for months. Still here. That's enough for tonight. The first hard frost came in the third week of October, earlier than anyone in Caldwell Creek could remember seeing it. Margaret noticed it before sunrise, when she went to pull water from the spring house and found a thin skim of ice across the surface of the bucket she'd left outside. She stood there in the gray pre-dawn holding the bucket and looking at the sky, which had the particular dense, yellowish quality of a sky, storing something it wasn't ready to release yet. She'd grown up in Philadelphia, where weather arrived with a certain civic predictability. Montana, she was learning, operated on its own terms entirely and informed you of them only when it felt like it. She mentioned it at breakfast. "Sky looks wrong," she said, setting Colton's coffee on the table. He glanced up from the harness he was examining, a habit she'd noticed. He often brought small repair tasks to the breakfast table, which she'd found annoying at first and had since stopped thinking about. "Which direction?" "Northwest, that yellow light." He put the harness down and went to the window. He stood there for a moment without saying anything, and she had learned enough about him by now to know that the quality of his silence had meaning. This one was the focused kind, not the comfortable kind. "Hector," he said, though Hector was in the bunkhouse and couldn't hear him. He said it the way people say things when they're already thinking 3 steps ahead. He went out after breakfast without finishing his coffee, which he never did, and she watched from the kitchen window as he stood in the yard with Hector and Eli, all 3 of them looking northwest with the same expression. She couldn't hear the conversation. She didn't need to. She went back to the accounts. By noon, the wind had shifted. By mid-afternoon, it had teeth. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in the span of 2 hours. She knew because she kept a small thermometer mounted outside the kitchen window, a habit from her Philadelphia years that Colton had found mildly puzzling when he first noticed it. At 3 o'clock, it read 41 degrees. At 5 o'clock, it read 26, and the first sleet had begun, coming in sideways from the northwest and hitting the window glass like thrown gravel. Colton and the hands had spent the afternoon driving the cattle toward the lower pastures, away from the exposed ridge lines. She could hear the distant noise of it through the walls, the lowing of frightened animals, the occasional shout. She heated water and kept it on the stove and prepared what food she could, because she understood without being told that when they came in, they would be cold and exhausted and would need to go back out again. Hector came in first, just after 5, ice in his beard, his hands shaking as he tried to work the buttons of his coat. She poured coffee and put a bowl of stew in front of him before he'd managed to sit down completely. "How many are out?" she asked. Most of the North herd. His accent thickened when he was cold or tired. She'd noticed that. "Maybe 200 head. Colton's still out there. Eli, too." "The south fence?" "Holding, for now." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "This is going to get worse tonight, Mrs. Holloway. This isn't a regular frost. I've seen this kind before. This is going to be real bad." She didn't answer him. She went back to the stove. Colton and Eli came in at 6:30, and she knew from the way Colton moved through the door, head down, one shoulder held slightly higher than the other, jaw tight, that things outside were not good. She didn't ask immediately. She let them get inside and get their coats off and get something in their stomachs, because she had learned from 11 years of caring for a sick man that there was a moment when a person needed to simply be warm before they could think clearly about anything else. "The north fence is down," Colton said finally, between spoonfuls of stew he was eating standing up, which he only did when he didn't intend to stay long. "Section near the ravine. The ice weight brought the posts over. Could be 50, 60 head scattered past the tree line." "In the dark," Eli said quietly, not quite a complaint. "We'll need lights," Colton said. "And rope. The creek crossings are going to be iced. We'll need to check everyone before we—" "Eat the rest of that first," Margaret said. He looked at her. "The animals have been out for 6 hours already," she said, keeping her voice even. 3 more minutes won't cost you the herd. Eat." A pause. Then Colton looked back down at the bowl and finished it. They went back out at 7, all 3 of them, with lanterns and rope, and the grim, wordless determination of men who had done hard things before and knew the only way through was through. Margaret stood in the doorway and watched the lanterns diminish into the dark and the sleet, 3 small moving lights swallowed by the weather, and then she shut the door and went back to work. She stoked the stove to maximum heat. She boiled more water. She found every blanket in the house and stacked them near the fireplace. She inventoried the medical kit, the one she'd reorganized in her first week, which had been chaos before she got to it, and laid out what she thought they might need: the liniment, the bandaging, the salve for cold, cracked skin. She moved through this house with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided that feeling afraid is a luxury the situation can't afford. Around 9 o'clock, the sleet became snow. Not the gentle, picturesque kind, the heavy driving kind, the kind that comes in on a hard wind and reduces visibility to the length of your arm. She could hear it against the walls, a sound somewhere between hissing and moaning, and the temperature inside the house dropped despite the stove working full. She put on her coat indoors and kept moving. At 11, Eli came back alone. She heard him on the porch before the door opened and had coffee ready when he came through. He was moving wrong, stiff, too careful with his right arm, and when he got closer, she could see his face was paper white under the weathering. "Where are the others?" she said. "Colton sent me back. Said one of us needed to—" He stopped, exhaled. He found most of the north herd, got them moving toward the lower pasture. Hector's with him. He sat down heavily in the kitchen chair. "Mrs. Holloway, there's a bull. Big one, the one Colton calls the Colonel. Broke through the ice on the East Creek crossing. Spooked bad. He's up on the North Ridge and he's not coming down easy." "Is Colton going up?" Eli hesitated. "He said not to tell you that," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Take the blanket and sit by the fire." "How's your arm?" "It's fine." "It is not fine. You're holding it like it's broken." "It's not broken. I got knocked against a fence post. It'll be all right." She examined it, not gently but efficiently, pressing along the bone while he made controlled sounds of discomfort, and concluded that he was probably right, not broken, but badly bruised in the way that would make him near useless for physical work for at least a week. She wrapped it, told him to stay where he was, and meant it. Then she put on her heaviest coat, her wool scarf, her gloves, and her boots. Eli looked at her from the chair. "What are you doing?" "There are horses in the barn," she said. "Mrs. Holloway." "Eli." She said it quietly. "How many cattle does Colton stand to lose if that bull comes down wrong and spooks the rest of the north herd back over the ridge?" He was quiet. "That's what I thought," she said. "Stay by the fire." The barn was barely 30 feet from the house, but crossing those 30 feet in the storm took real effort. The wind hit her broadside and nearly knocked her sideways, and the snow was already 6 inches deep and falling fast, the kind of accumulation that happened when a storm was serious about itself. She got inside the barn and stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, the comparative warmth and animal smell of it almost disorienting after the brutality outside. She saddled the roan herself. It took longer than it should have because her hands were already cold and the buckles were stiff, and the mare was unhappy about the storm sounds and kept shifting her weight in the way of a horse that knows bad weather when she hears it. Margaret spoke to her in a low, steady voice, not the soothing nonsense people directed at animals, but direct conversation, which the mare seemed to find more convincing. "I know," she told the horse. "I don't want to be out there either, but here we are." She rode out into the storm. She knew where the East Creek crossing was because she had studied Colton's land maps in her first week, one of the first organizational tasks she'd undertaken, cataloging and understanding the physical layout of the ranch the same way she'd cataloged the supply accounts. She knew the North Ridge was above the creek, accessible by a trail that ran along the east fence line. She knew it because knowing things like that was what she did, had always done, even when no one thought to ask her about it. The ride was miserable in the way that transcends ordinary complaint. The wind was a physical thing, shoving against her and the horse, and the snow had no consideration for human direction at all. The trail was invisible under the accumulation, and she navigated by fence line and landmark, and the particular stubbornness that had gotten her through 11 years of a sick room, and 2 months of being thrown away, and 6 weeks on a stranger's ranch without quite coming apart. She heard the bull before she saw anything, a deep, frightened bellow from somewhere above, and then Colton's voice, lower, with the careful cadence of someone talking an animal down from a ledge, and Hector's voice answering from somewhere to the left. She came up over a rise and saw them in the swinging light of Colton's lantern. The bull, a massive animal, probably 1,400 pounds, dark-coated and wild-eyed, was standing at the edge of the ridge, where the ground dropped away into the ravine below. Too close to the edge. Colton was below him on the slope, 15 feet away, moving slowly, talking steadily, trying to angle the animal back from the drop. Hector was further around, trying to cut off the escape route to the left. What happened next was fast. The bull moved, not toward the ravine, but sideways, a sudden lurching pivot on the iced ground, and Colton's horse, startled, pulled back hard. Colton kept his seat, but the horse's rear legs slipped on the ice, and they went down sideways. And Colton went into the ravine wall with a sound she heard clearly, even over the storm wind, a hard, dull impact that was the sound of a person hitting stone. Hector shouted something. Margaret was already moving. She got to Colton before Hector did, off the mare, and sliding the last few feet down the icy slope on her knees in a way that would leave bruises she'd feel for 2 weeks. He was on his side against the stone face of the ravine, his right arm trapped under him, and for the 2 seconds before he moved, she felt something cold in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. Then he moved. He started. "Don't," she said. She got her hands on him, running assessment the same way she'd assessed Eli's arm. Pressing, checking, watching his face for the involuntary signs of serious damage that people couldn't mask even when they were trying to. His shoulder was wrong. She could feel it. Not broken, but the joint had done something it wasn't supposed to do, and the way he went still and white when she pressed it told her the pain was significant. "Can you move your fingers?" she said. He moved them. "Yes." "Your legs?" He shifted them, hissed through his teeth. "Yes." "All right." She sat back on her heels in the snow and looked at him. "You're going to need help getting up." "Where's the bull?" "Hector has him." She looked up. Hector had gotten a rope on the animal and was walking him back from the ridge edge with the focused care of a man who understood exactly how close to disaster they were. "He's fine. You're the one on the ground." Colton looked at her, really looked at her, the lantern light catching his face, and she saw something move through his expression that she didn't entirely know how to read. Not surprise, exactly. More like the revision of a calculation. "You rode out here," he said. "Yes. In this storm." "I'm aware of the conditions, Mr. Hayes. I was just in them. I told Eli. Eli told me." She stood up and held out her hand. "Can you get up with help?" He took her hand and got up, slowly, favoring the right shoulder with a discipline that told her it hurt considerably more than he was acknowledging. She let him hold on to her arm until he was steady. The ride back was slow and hard. Colton managed his horse one-handed, mostly through the horse's own homing instinct, and Colton's balance, which was remarkable given how much pain he was in. Hector brought the bull down behind them, and they stopped twice to check the lower pasture gates, which were holding. By the time they reached the barn, it was past 1 in the morning. Inside the warmth of the house, with Eli awake by the fire and more coffee on and the storm still driving against the walls, she got Colton's coat off and his shirt off the right shoulder and examined the joint in the proper light. She had seen enough injuries during Robert's illness, and before, during her teaching years when children fell and farm accidents happened, to know what she was looking at. "It's dislocated," she said. "I know what it is," he said through his teeth. "I can put it back." He looked at her. "It'll hurt," she said. "Significantly. But it'll hurt less than riding to town for a doctor in this storm, and considerably less than leaving it until morning." Hector, from the other side of the table, said nothing. Eli said nothing. Colton looked at her for another moment. "Do it," he said. She'd done it once before, years ago, when a student's father had dislocated his shoulder hauling a stuck wagon wheel and there'd been no one else. She remembered the mechanics of it, had thought about it carefully on the ride home from the ridge. She positioned herself, placed her hands, told Colton to breathe out, and when he did, she applied the traction and rotation in one controlled, deliberate movement. The sound it made was not pleasant. Colton made one short, involuntary noise and then went completely silent, which was somehow worse. Then he rolled his shoulder experimentally, and the relief that crossed his face, genuine, unguarded, the expression of a man in serious pain suddenly reduced to manageable pain, was one of the more honest things she'd seen on a human face in years. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Rest it for 2 weeks," she said. "No riding." He started to object, and she looked at him, and he stopped. Outside, the storm continued its indifferent work, throwing snow against the walls and piling it against the fence posts and blanketing the pastures under a weight that would take days to lift. But inside the kitchen of Silver Creek Ranch, there was light and heat and 4 people who had come through something hard together. And that was a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. Over the next 3 days, with Colton's shoulder immobilized and his ability to manage the ranch physically reduced to shouting instructions from the porch, Margaret ran Silver Creek. She did it without ceremony and without asking permission, because the work didn't wait for either. She organized Hector and Eli into rotating shifts, one watching the cattle in the lower pasture, one handling feed and water, both reporting back to her every 3 hours. She kept the supply log obsessively, tracking what they were burning through so she could calculate resupply needs before the roads cleared. She rationed the hay with the precision of someone who had run household accounts through lean years and knew the difference between adequate and comfortable and desperate. On the second day, she rode out herself with Hector to check the east fence, the section that had blown down in the first hours of the storm. She had to see the damage for herself to understand the repair order, because estimates from men who were exhausted were always optimistic. The damage was worse than reported. Not 2 sections, but 4, one of them requiring new posts, not just restringing. She noted it all down in the small notebook she'd taken to carrying in her coat pocket. On the 3rd day, when the storm began to exhaust itself and the wind dropped and the snow thinned to occasional flurries, she sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and her notebook and calculated what Silver Creek had lost. Colton came in from the porch where he'd been standing in the cold air, against her explicit instructions, but she had given up fighting that particular battle and sat down across from her. "Tell me," he said. 4 sections of east fence need work. 7 head lost. 3 I know are in the ravine below the north ridge. The other 4 unaccounted for. Your hay reserves are down significantly. You'll need to resupply before the next hard freeze." She looked up. "But the herd is largely intact. Hector says the Aldridge Ranch to the north lost close to 40% of theirs." Colton absorbed that. "We lost 7, he said. 7, she confirmed. "In a storm Hector says he's seen kill 100 in an hour." He was quiet for a moment. She went back to the ledger. "Margaret," he said. She looked up. He'd used her first name exactly twice before, both times by accident, both times immediately followed by the formal correction as though it had slipped out. This time there was no correction. "You rode out into that storm," he said, "in the middle of the night, alone." "You were hurt," she said. "I could have managed." "You were lying in a ravine with a dislocated shoulder." "I've had worse." She looked at him steadily. "I know you have. That's not the point." He held her gaze. "Then what is the point?" She thought about how to say it honestly, without making it larger than it was. "The point," she said finally, "is that it's a working arrangement. You said so yourself. I manage the household and the accounts. Last I checked, the herd is part of this household." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "And my shoulder," he said. "That was personal," she said, and looked back down at the ledger before she could see whatever expression followed that, because she wasn't entirely sure she was ready for it. The storm left Silver Creek Ranch standing. Not intact. The fences needed work. The hay barn needed cleaning out. 7 animals were gone and would stay gone. But standing, which was more than could be said for the neighboring ranches that had faced the same storm with better resources and worse luck, or worse preparation, or simply without someone who had been desperate enough and stubborn enough to reorganize a root cellar and study land maps in her first week, because knowing the shape of a thing was the only way she knew to stop being afraid of it. When the roads cleared enough for travel, the first neighbors to come by were the Aldridge family from the north, wanting to know how Silver Creek had survived so well. Colton brought them inside and gave them coffee, and then he said, in the simple way he had of stating facts, "Ask Mrs. Holloway. She ran the ranch." 3 people looked at her. Margaret set down her coffee cup. "Sit down," she said. I'll tell you what we did." She told them. All of it. The rotation schedule, the hay rationing, the fence assessment, the cattle management in the lower pasture. She told them without vanity and without false modesty, because both were useless things to bring to a table where people needed real information. By the time they left, they had taken 3 pages of notes. By the end of the week, 2 more families had come by. The town of Caldwell Creek had spent 6 weeks watching Margaret Holloway with the particular attention reserved for people they expected to fail. They had been waiting for the old woman from Philadelphia to crack under the weight of the frontier, to prove the whispers right, to give them the satisfying conclusion of a story that confirmed what they already believed about women of a certain age and the limits of what they could manage. The storm had not cooperated with that narrative, and Caldwell Creek, to its credit, was a place full of practical people, people who grew their own food and fixed their own fences and understood, in their bones, the difference between someone who could do a thing and someone who merely claimed to. Practical people updated their assessments when the evidence required it. They were beginning, slowly and without making much noise about it, to update theirs. The shoulder healed slower than Colton wanted and faster than Margaret expected, which put them at odds for most of November in the specific way that 2 stubborn people are at odds when they disagree about what constitutes sufficient recovery. He was back on a horse by the 3rd week, which was 10 days earlier than she'd told him was acceptable. She found out when she came around the side of the barn and saw him mounting up, his right arm moving with the careful deliberateness of someone pretending they weren't in pain. She stood there with a bucket of kitchen scraps for the pigs and looked at him. He looked back at her from the saddle. "The fence on the south line needs," he started. "Eli can check the fence," she said. "Eli doesn't know the south line like I do." "Then describe it to him." Margaret. "Colton." They looked at each other for a moment across the cold yard, and then he turned the horse and rode out, because he was going to do what he was going to do, and they both knew it, and she went back inside and put an extra helping of the liniment on the kitchen table where he'd find it without her having to say anything more about it. That was how they managed most of their disagreements. Not with shouting, neither of them was a shouter, but with the particular friction of 2 people who had developed opinions about how things should be done and had enough respect for each other to argue, but not enough give to always back down. It was not comfortable. It was, she had come to understand, honest. And honest friction was something she had been missing for so long that even when it irritated her, There was something underneath the irritation that felt like being seen. November settled into December, and December brought the kind of cold that made October's storm seem like a rehearsal. The temperature stayed below freezing for weeks at a stretch. The creek iced over fully, and the days shortened until it felt like true dark arrived before the afternoon was finished. The ranch contracted inward, the way all living things do in deep cold, conserving, managing, waiting. The evenings got long. That was how it started, really. Not with any particular moment or declaration, but with the simple arithmetic of a long Montana winter evening. 2 people in a house, the work done for the day, the fire burning, and nowhere particular to be. Hector and Eli were in the bunkhouse. The horses were stabled. The accounts were balanced. She'd gotten them into a state of order that satisfied even her exacting standards, which had surprised her, because she hadn't expected the satisfaction to feel so clean. The first evening it happened, Colton was at the desk reading his cattle management volume, and she was sewing a tear in the curtain she'd been meaning to fix for 3 weeks, and he said without looking up, "Did you teach in Philadelphia long?" She looked at him. 14 years. What did you teach? Primary grades, mostly. Reading, arithmetic, some history. She went back to the curtain. Why? Just wondering. He turned a page. You have a way of explaining things, like when the Aldridge family came. You didn't talk down to them. Why would I? Most people do, when they know more than whoever they're talking to. She thought about that. Talking down to people is a waste of everyone's time. It doesn't get the information across any better. No, he agreed. It doesn't. He went back to his book. She went back to the curtain. But something had opened in the room. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just a door pushed slightly ajar that hadn't been before. The next evening he told her about his parents. Not all at once. Not as a story with a beginning and an end, but in the fragmented way people discuss things that still have rough edges. Pieces offered and then pulled back slightly, tested to see whether the listener would treat them carefully. His father had been a cattleman in Missouri, his mother a woman who'd taught herself to read from a single Bible and then moved on to every other book she could find, which was how the Shakespeare volume ended up on the shelf. They'd been ordinary, difficult, beloved people, and losing them both in the same winter week had done something to him that he'd spent 15 years working around rather than through. I built the second bedroom for a wife, he said, one evening in mid-December, looking at the fire rather than at her. When I built the house, I was 26. I thought by then I'd have... He stopped. It didn't work out that way. What happened? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Nothing dramatic. There was a woman in town. This was 12 years ago, different town before I moved the operation here. We understood each other, I thought. She understood what I was building, what the work was. He shifted in his chair. When it came to it, she didn't want the life. She wanted a different life with a man who had more certainty to offer. He said it without bitterness, which she found more affecting than bitterness would have been. She wasn't wrong to want that. I just couldn't be that man. You never tried again, she said. It wasn't quite a question. I'm not good at things I'm not sure of, he said. Never have been. I know cattle. I know this land. I know how to work. The other... He shook his head slightly. I stopped assuming I knew how to do it. She looked at him for a moment. He was still watching the fire, the same way he watched difficult terrain, evaluating, patient, not rushing to conclusions. I was married for 23 years, she said. I thought I knew what that was, how it worked. She folded the sewing in her lap. I'm not sure I did, looking back. I knew how to manage it, how to keep it going. That's not the same thing as understanding it. He looked at her then. Were you unhappy? He asked, directly, the way he asked most things. She considered the honest answer. Not always. Not most of the time. But there was a long stretch, maybe the last 10 years, during his illness, when I realized that I had become someone he needed rather than someone he knew. And I didn't know which one had happened first. She paused. I don't say that to speak ill of him. He was a decent man. He was just... She looked for the right word. Not a man who asked many questions about the person in the room with him. And your son, Colton said carefully. Thomas is his father's son, she said. in that particular way. He nodded slowly and didn't press it, which was one of the things she had come to value about him. He understood the difference between asking and pushing, and he had a feel for where the line was. "It's strange," she said after a moment. "I spent years being necessary. To Robert, to the students, to the household. I was necessary to everyone, but necessity isn't the same as mattering." She looked at the fire. "I think I confused them for a long time." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. "You matter here," he said quietly. Not theatrically, just stated the way he stated facts about weather or cattle or account figures. She didn't answer, but something in her chest shifted, the way ice shifts in a river when the temperature rises by the 1 degree that makes the difference. These evenings accumulated like snow, gradually, without drama, until one morning she looked up and realized there was a significant accumulation that hadn't been there before. They had found a rhythm that belonged to neither of them individually, something built from the overlap of their particular habits and silences, and the specific way they disagreed about whether the fire needed another log. He started leaving the almanac on her side of the table when he was done with it, without mentioning it. She started making 2 cups of coffee in the morning without thinking about it, and setting one at his place before he came in, and didn't examine that habit too closely. Hector noticed before either of them acknowledged it. She knew because she caught him watching them one morning at breakfast with an expression of settled amusement, and when she looked at him, he looked immediately at his coffee cup with the unconvincing innocence of a man pretending he hadn't been doing exactly what he'd been doing. "Something funny?" she asked him. "No, ma'am," he said. "Hector," Colton said. "Nothing," Hector said. "Just a nice morning." It was 14 degrees outside. Christmas came and went with the modest ceremony of a frontier household. She made a proper meal, the first one she'd made with genuine pleasure rather than pure pragmatism, and Colton produced from somewhere a small wrapped package that contained a leather-bound notebook with her name written on the inside front cover in his careful handwriting. Not Mrs. Holloway, just Margaret. She had to look out the window for a moment before she could respond. "It's for the accounts," he said, and she could hear in his voice that he was slightly uncertain, that he'd worried over whether it was appropriate and hadn't fully resolved the question. "I know," she said. "It's exactly right." She had not bought him anything because she hadn't known she was supposed to, and that bothered her for 2 days until she resolved it by making him a proper pie from the dried apples in the cellar, which she left on the table without comment. He ate half of it in one sitting and said nothing about it, which meant she had learned that it was the best thing he'd eaten in recent memory. January brought the hard work of midwinter maintenance, repairs that couldn't wait for spring, equipment that needed attending, the ongoing management of hay reserves that she tracked with the same obsessive precision she brought to the supply accounts. She and Colton fell into a working pattern that was so natural by now that she sometimes caught herself marveling at it, this thing that had no name and hadn't been negotiated and simply existed. It was in January that he told her about the parents' deaths in full. Not fragments this time. The whole thing, start to finish, sitting at the table after dinner with the remains of the meal between them and the wind outside and the lamps turned down low. His father had gotten sick first, the chest illness that moved through that region every few years, and took the oldest and the youngest most reliably. His mother had nursed him and gotten it herself, and they had died within 5 days of each other. His father first and his mother following, as if she'd decided there was no reason to do otherwise. He'd been 24. He'd buried them himself because the ground was frozen, and it took 3 days, and he'd been alone for most of it. She listened without interrupting, without the reflexive sounds of sympathy that often made telling a hard story harder by reminding the teller that someone is listening so intently they need to perform the emotion properly. She just listened, and when he was done, she said, "You were alone a long time before you were alone." He looked at her. "What does that mean?" he said. "It means losing people that way, that fast. It doesn't just leave you alone. It makes you expect to be alone. It starts to feel like the natural condition." She paused. "I know that particular feeling." He was quiet for a moment. "When did it start for you?" "Probably when Thomas was about 12, she said. "When I understood that he wasn't going to be the kind of son who stayed close. Some children move toward you as they grow, some move away. You can't always tell which one you have until it's already happened." She looked at her hands on the table. "And then Robert's illness took the last 10 years, and I was necessary, but not..." She stopped. I was in every room and somehow in no room at all. And now? He said. She looked up. He was watching her with that direct, undecorated attention she had come to know well enough to read. He wasn't asking to fill silence. He wasn't asking the way people ask questions they already know the answer to. He was asking because he actually didn't know and actually wanted to. Now, she said carefully, I'm in the room. He didn't answer right away. The fire shifted and settled. Outside, the wind made its steady commentary against the walls. I want to say something, he said, and I'd like you to hear it before you decide what to do with it. She waited. I didn't bring you here because I felt sorry for you, he said. I know that's what people think. I know that's probably what you thought at the start. He looked at the table, then back at her, and the directness in it was effortful in a way she could see. A man who said plain things easily, working hard to say this particular plain thing. What I saw in that street was a woman who walked straight when she should have fallen down. That's not pity. I don't bring people to my home out of pity. I brought you here because I thought... He stopped. I thought if I didn't, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what I'd walked away from. Margaret sat with that. She was 56 years old. She had spent 11 years in a sick room and 2 months being discarded and 6 weeks learning to trust again with the careful caution of someone who had been burned recently enough to still feel it. She knew her own face in a mirror, the gray hair and the lines and the evidence of a life that had been lived hard in places. And she had made a certain peace with it, the peace of a woman who had stopped expecting to be looked at a particular way. But he was looking at her exactly the way she'd stopped expecting. You are, she said slowly, the most straightforward man I have ever met in my life. Is that a problem? No, she said. It's terrifying. But no. Something loosened in his face. Genuine relief, unguarded, the expression of a man who had been holding something carefully for a long time and was finally setting it down. I'm not an easy person, she said. I should tell you that directly. I have opinions about nearly everything, and I'm not always right about them, but I'm usually convinced I am until proven otherwise. I don't like being managed. I spent too many years being managed by circumstances, and I have very little patience left for it. I know, he said. You've known me 4 months. I know, he said again, with a quiet certainty that was not arrogance, but something closer to recognition. And I'm 56, she said, in case that Margaret. He said her name in the specific way he'd developed lately, with the slight emphasis of someone who knows the name well enough to use it precisely. I know how old you are. I know what the town says about it. I know what your face looks like, and how you take your coffee, and how you talk to the horses, and what your handwriting looks like in the ledger at 3 a.m. None of those things are problems I'm trying to work around. She looked at him for a long moment. Then what are you proposing? She said. Practical to the last. He actually almost smiled at that. What I'm proposing, he said, is that you stop thinking of yourself as a temporary arrangement. It was not a formal proposal. It was not down on one knee with a ring, which was not his manner, and which she would have found bizarre and somewhat alarming given the circumstances. It was a man who communicated in the currency of direct statements, telling her the most important direct thing he'd said to her yet. She thought about this woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 4 months ago. The woman with 1 suitcase and $40 from her son, and the specific humiliation of being publicly discarded by a man who'd made her a promise on paper. The woman who had lain awake in Mrs. Alderman's boarding house, telling herself, still here, that's enough for tonight. She thought about what she had built since then. The accounts, and the root cellar, and the storm, and the shoulder, and the leather notebook with her name on the inside cover, and the evenings by the fire, and this man across the table who looked at her like she was someone worth the trouble of knowing. She thought about how none of it had been what she'd planned. She'd planned for a merchant and a housekeeper arrangement, and a modest, adequate end to a life that had taken too much from her. She hadn't planned for this. She hadn't planned for any of it. I'm not good at being uncertain, she said. Fair warning. Neither am I, he said. We'll be terrible at it together then. Probably, he agreed. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Not dramatically, not with the weight of declaration, just the simple placement of one hand on another, the most ordinary and unrepeatable gesture in the world. He turned his hand over and held hers. Outside, the Montana winter continued without concern for either of them. The wind and the dark, and the cold doing what Montana winter did, regardless of what happened inside the walls of the houses people built against it. But inside Silver Creek Ranch, with the fire burning low and the lamps turned down and the remains of dinner still on the table between them, something that had been building since a September afternoon on a dusty street finally settled into the shape it had been heading toward all along. They sat there for a while, not talking. It didn't require talking. The accounts were balanced, the herd was intact, the fence would hold until spring, and the borrowed room had, somewhere in the past 4 months, become the only room she wanted to be in. She was still here. It was, she had come to understand, considerably more than enough. They were married in March, when the snow was still on the ground, but the light had changed, that particular shift in Montana light that happens in early spring, where the sun starts arriving at a different angle and everything it touches looks slightly more awake than it did the week before. The wedding was not elaborate. Margaret had no interest in elaborate, and Colton had even less. They rode into Caldwell Creek on a Tuesday morning, said what needed to be said in front of Judge Harlan Birch, signed the papers, and rode back to Silver Creek in the afternoon. Hector and Eli were waiting at the house with a bottle of whiskey Hector had been saving for an occasion he considered worthy, and they sat around the kitchen table and drank a glass each, and that was the ceremony. It was, Margaret thought, exactly right. The town had opinions about it. The town always had opinions. Some of them were expressed to her face. The more generous ones, from people who had revised their assessments after the October storm, and the string of families who'd come through Silver Creek seeking advice on winter management. A few of the original detractors maintained their positions with the stubborn loyalty of people who had committed to a conclusion and found it inconvenient to abandon it. She didn't spend energy on those. She had learned, somewhere in the last 6 months, that other people's theories about her life had a very limited jurisdiction. What she hadn't anticipated was how much the marriage would change things not for herself, but for other people. It started with a woman named Ruth Pearson. Ruth came to the ranch in April, on foot, which told Margaret something immediately, that there was no horse, or no money for one, or both. She was maybe 45, with the look of someone who had been capable once, and had spent a few years having that capability beaten down by circumstances she hadn't chosen. A widow, it turned out, whose husband had died in a logging accident the previous autumn, leaving her with 40 acres of difficult land, no livestock, and 2 grown daughters who had married and moved further west, and were not, for reasons Ruth explained with the careful understatement of a woman who had made peace with the disappointment, coming back. She stood at the door and said she'd heard that Mrs. Hayes might know of work. Margaret looked at her for a moment. "Come in," she said. "Have you eaten today?" Ruth hadn't. Margaret fed her first because that was the rational order of things, and then she sat down across from her and asked the direct questions. What did she know how to do? What did her land look like? What did she owe and to whom? Ruth answered all of it precisely and without self-pity, and Margaret listened the way she always listened, gathering information, sorting it, looking for the shape of the actual problem underneath the surface of the described one. The actual problem was not that Ruth needed work. The actual problem was that Ruth had no framework for understanding what her 40 acres were worth and what she could do with them. And without that framework, she was making decisions based on fear rather than information, which was the most expensive way anyone could possibly operate. "I'm not going to offer you a housekeeping position," Margaret said. Ruth looked at her. "What I'm going to do," Margaret continued, "is show you your own accounts, and then we're going to figure out what you actually have before you decide you don't have enough." It took 3 weeks. Ruth came to Silver Creek every Tuesday and Thursday, and Margaret sat with her at the kitchen table with ledger paper and the territory land assessment records, and walked her through the arithmetic of her own situation in the patient, unpatronizing way she'd learned to explain things to 12-year-olds who believed they were bad at numbers until someone showed them they weren't. By the end of those 3 weeks, Ruth Pearson understood that her 40 acres, properly managed, could support a small dairy operation that would more than sustain her. She didn't need a job. She needed information and a plan and someone willing to spend time on her as though she were worth the time. She left the last Tuesday session with a ledger of her own, one of the plain ones Margaret bought in bulk from Henderson's store, and a handwritten outline of the first 6 months of her dairy operation. And she stood in the yard beside her horse with her eyes bright, in the way of someone who has just been handed back something they thought was gone. I don't know how to thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Margaret said. Come back in 6 months and tell me how it's going. That's enough. Ruth came back in 6 months. The dairy was operating. She'd hired a part-time hand. She was, for the first time since her husband's death, not afraid when she looked at her own land. Word moved the way word moved in frontier territory, along fence lines and supply routes, and the social architecture of church socials and town meetings, and the informal network of women who talked to each other across back fences and at the dry goods counter. By summer, there was a pattern forming that Margaret hadn't planned, and Colton noticed before she consciously acknowledged it. You have people coming every week now, he said one evening, not as a complaint, as an observation. I know, she said. 3 this week. 4, actually. 1 came Tuesday when you were out at the south pasture. He was quiet for a moment. Is this going to become a regular thing? She looked at him. Does it bother you? He thought about it with his characteristic honesty. No, I'm trying to understand what it is. It's what I know how to do, she said. I know how to teach. I know how to work with accounts. There are women in this territory who have the capacity to manage their own situations, and nobody has ever sat down with them long enough to show them how. She paused. That seems like a solvable problem. He looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. All right? All right, he repeated. What do you need? That was the conversation that led to the schoolroom. It wasn't a separate building at first, just the front room on the days when the kitchen table wasn't big enough for the number of women who started arriving. Margaret organized it deliberately, the way she organized everything, with a clear purpose, a practical curriculum, and absolutely no sentimentality about it. She taught bookkeeping, basic contract law as it applied to property and land claims, reading for the women who needed it without apology or ceremony, and the specific practical mathematics of running a frontier household or small operation. She was not gentle about errors. She was not gentle about excuses. She was, as more than one woman told another, exactly like having a school teacher who had personally survived everything she was teaching you to survive, which was a different quality of instruction than any of them had encountered before. Colton built the actual schoolroom in the fall, a separate room off the side of the house, with proper windows and a wood stove and enough table space for 8 people to work at once. He built it without being asked and without making an announcement about it. She came around the side of the house one October morning and found him and Eli framing the walls, and she stood there and looked at it. You didn't tell me you were doing this, she said. You didn't ask, he said, lining up a board. But you needed it. She didn't answer. She went back inside and got everyone more coffee, because she had learned that there were things Colton Hayes did that required no response beyond letting him do them. The children came later, almost as a natural consequence. The women who came for the bookkeeping sessions brought their children because there was no alternative, and the children sat in the corner with their hands folded or they didn't, and Margaret found herself doing what she'd spent 14 years doing in Philadelphia without thinking about it, pulling a child toward her and explaining something, showing them a page, asking a question, and actually waiting for the answer. She started holding sessions for the children on Friday mornings. By the following spring, 11 children were coming regularly, from 5 different families, covering distances that required some of them to leave before sunrise to arrive on time. She taught them reading and arithmetic and the practical geography of the territory they lived in, and she was not a soft teacher. She never had been, but she was a fair one, which was rarer than it should have been. Hector's nephew, a boy of about 9 named Miguel, who had recently come from his family in New Mexico to work on the ranch, became her most devoted and most difficult student simultaneously. He was bright in the specific, uncomfortable way of children who are bored by what's easy and obstinate about what's hard. And he and Margaret conducted a sustained campaign of mutual stubbornness for about 3 months before he decided that she was not going to give up on him and relaxed into actually learning. Colton watched all of it from a careful distance, the way he watched most things, observing, cataloging, not interfering. He was not a man who needed to put his hands on everything to feel like it was his. He had built her the room. He managed the ranch. He let her manage everything she'd decided to manage, and the combination of those 2 operating territories produced something that worked the way the accounts work now, clean, functional, each element in its proper place. They were not a perfect couple. That should be said plainly. They disagreed regularly and sometimes at volume about supply decisions and ranch management, and Margaret's habit of taking on more than was reasonable, and Colton's corresponding habit of handling things alone that he should have asked for help with. He was still a man who had lived solo for 15 years and had the difficult habits of someone deeply set in his own methods. She was still a woman who had strong opinions about nearly everything and the educational background to argue them at length. They were, in other words, two specific people with specific flaws trying to build something specific, which is the only way anything worth building actually gets built. He learned to say when he was struggling before she had to figure it out by watching him move wrong. She learned to say when she'd taken on too much before she made herself sick, proving she hadn't. It took a while. These were not natural habits for either of them. What they were, by the second year, was settled. Not in the way of things that have given up, but in the way of things that have found their actual shape. The autumn afternoon that Thomas arrived, Margaret was in the schoolroom with 3 of the Friday children, working through a long division problem that had created a significant disagreement about method. She heard a horse in the yard and assumed it was one of the later families arriving, and so she didn't go to the window. Colton came to the schoolroom door. The look on his face told her something before he said a word. Not alarm, more like the careful expression of a man delivering information he's not certain how to calibrate. "There's a man outside," he said. "Says his name is Thomas Holloway." She put her pencil down on the table. The 3 children looked between her and Colton with the acute social radar of children who understand that something is happening even when they don't know what. "Finish the problem," she told them. "The method on the left is correct. Work through it." She went outside. Thomas was standing in the yard beside a horse that had seen better years. He himself had seen better years. The man standing before her was recognizably her son. The jaw, the height, Robert's eyes. But something had happened to him in the 2 years since she'd last seen him, some process of reduction that had taken the cold, calculating certainty she remembered, and worn it down to something more uncertain. He was 43 years old, and he looked tired in the specific way of a man who has been carrying something he chose for himself and found it heavier than he expected. He had his hat in his hands. She didn't know when she'd last seen Thomas Holloway with his hat in his hands. "Mother," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Thomas." A pause. He looked at the house, the schoolroom addition, the barn, the fence lines in the distance. She watched him taking the inventory of what she'd built and seeing it for what it was, which was considerably more than he'd have predicted. "You look well," he said. "I am well." She didn't soften it or expand it. "What happened?" He exhaled. "The business failed. In Denver. He stopped, started again. "I made a series of decisions that I was confident about at the time. And now? And now I have very little," he said, "and fewer people than I had then." She understood what that meant. She understood it completely, in the way you understand something that has a shape you recognize. "Come inside," she said. She fed him because that was the rational first step, and because she was, in spite of everything, still his mother and he was clearly hungry. Colton sat at the far end of the kitchen table with the careful neutrality of a man who has decided that this situation belongs to his wife and that his job is to be present without taking up too much room. She appreciated that more than she said. Thomas ate and looked at the room around him and didn't speak until the plate was mostly empty. "I came to ask," he said, "if there was any possibility—" "Of what?" she said. "Of a second chance," he said. Plainly. More plainly than she'd expected. "I know what I did. I know how I left. I've had considerable time recently to think about it clearly, and He stopped. "I don't have an excuse that covers it adequately. I know that." The kitchen was quiet. The wind outside. The distant sound of one of the Friday children shouting something in the schoolroom, followed by Hector's voice settling them down. He'd started helping on Friday mornings without anyone asking him to, which she'd accepted without comment. She looked at her son. She had thought about this over the past 2 years. Not obsessively, but in the honest way of someone who understands that unexamined things have a way of shaping you without your permission. She had thought about what she would say if this moment came, and she had arrived at a position that was neither forgiveness in the clean, cinematic sense, nor bitterness in the satisfying narrative sense, but something more complicated and more true than either. "I'm not going to pretend the last 2 years didn't happen," she said. or the years before them. I won't do that. Thomas nodded. He didn't argue. But I'm not going to spend the rest of my life carrying it either, she said. Not for your sake, for mine. I don't have the energy to maintain a wound I've already survived. He looked at his hands on the table. I have money I can give you, she said. Enough to start somewhere reasonable, if you're careful with it, which I would encourage you to be. She looked at him directly. I can write you a letter to a merchant I know in Billings who's looking for someone with business experience to help manage his accounts. It won't be a prestigious position, but it'll be honest work. That's, he started. Yes, that would be. I'm not done, she said. He went quiet. What I won't do, she said, is hand you back the life you left me without. This is my home. This is the life I built. It belongs to me and to Colton and to the people who come here on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Friday mornings. I'm glad you came. I'm glad you're standing here instead of wherever you've been. But I'm not going to be the soft place you land when the world finishes being hard to you. Thomas sat with that for a long moment. No, he said finally. You shouldn't be. It was the most honest thing she'd ever heard him say. He stayed one night. In the morning, she gave him an envelope with a careful sum inside and a letter for the Billings merchant, and she stood in the yard with Colton beside her and watched her son ride away from Silver Creek Ranch with the air of a man who had been told the truth in a way he could hear it. When he was out of sight, Colton said, You all right? She thought about it. Yes, she said, I think so. She watched the dust settle on the road. He's going to have to do it himself. I can't do it for him. I should have understood that earlier. You couldn't have, Colton said. You had to get here first. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the road, at the distance, at the particular angle of the autumn light across the Montana prairie. But the words sat there between them with the quiet weight of something true. She had to get here first. That was the part nobody wrote down in the advertisements. Not the merchant who had failed to meet her stagecoach, not the son who had handed her $40 and a direction, not the anonymous columnist who'd written Mature Woman of Steady Character Sought in a Philadelphia newspaper and set this entire chain of events in motion. Nobody had written down that the way through the worst thing that had ever happened to her was straight ahead, and that it would require crossing 2,000 miles and swallowing public humiliation, and trusting a stranger and riding into a blizzard in the middle of the night, and putting a dislocated shoulder back in its joint by firelight, and spending a Montana winter finding out, piece by careful piece, that she was more than necessary to someone. That she was known. The years that followed accumulated the way good years do. Not without difficulty, because nothing without difficulty is worth the space it takes up, but with the specific density of a life that is actually being lived rather than endured. Silver Creek Ranch grew. Colton hired 2 additional hands by the 3rd year, both of whom Margaret assessed carefully before giving her opinion, which Colton solicited and acted on, which was the kind of partnership she hadn't known to want until she had it. The school, she started calling it that, quietly, to herself, and then aloud, and eventually it was simply what it was, boy, served 43 students over the course of 5 years. Several of them went on to territorial schools, and 2 eventually east to colleges. A few of the women she'd worked with on their accounts started their own small operations. Ruth Pearson's dairy supplied 4 households in Caldwell Creek, and she had hired help she was paying fairly. Margaret knew the accounts of 6 frontier operations by name and by number, and could discuss any of them at length, which was its own kind of satisfaction. The town of Caldwell Creek, for its part, had quietly and without formal ceremony retired the version of Margaret Holloway it had constructed in those first September weeks. The cautionary tale, the charity case, the old woman who didn't belong on the frontier. In her place, without fanfare, they had substituted something closer to the truth. People called her Mrs. Hayes when they saw her in Henderson's store, and it wasn't the wary politeness of people managing someone inconvenient. It was the tone you use with someone whose opinion you'd go out of your way to hear. Harold Fitch, she heard through the natural circulation of small-town information, had moved his mercantile operation to a town further south. Clara Fitch had become Clara something else inside of 3 years. Margaret bore neither of them any particular feeling. They had happened in her life the way weather happened, without concern for her plans or her preferences, and she had come through it the same way. Bernard Coyle, Fitch's former business partner, had apologized to her formally in Henderson's store about 8 months after her arrival, which she'd acknowledged and moved past, because the apology wasn't the point. The point was never the apology. One evening in the autumn of their 3rd year of marriage, Colton came in from checking the south pasture and found her at the kitchen table with the ledger and a cup of cold coffee and the particular expression of someone absorbed in a calculation. He hung his coat, poured himself coffee, refilled hers without asking, and sat down across from her. She looked up. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was just thinking." "About the accounts?" "About the stagecoach," she said. That day, he waited. "I was so certain it was finished," she said, standing there on the street. "I had been so careful about it, the whole journey, keeping myself from expecting too much, telling myself it would simply be adequate, a practical arrangement, and then it wasn't even that, and I thought—" She stopped. "I genuinely thought that was it. The end of the story." He looked at her steadily. "It would have been," she said, "if you hadn't stopped your horse. You would have found your way," he said. "Maybe," she said, "eventually. But not here." She looked around the kitchen, the stove, the table, the window with the thermometer mounted outside, the doorway to the schoolroom she could hear Hector sweeping out because Friday was tomorrow. Not this. Colton turned his coffee cup in his hands, the habit he had when he was thinking about something he wanted to say, exactly right. "I almost didn't stop," he said. She looked at him. "I almost kept writing," he said. "I told myself it wasn't my business, that I didn't know you, that it was a bad idea to get involved in whatever that was." He looked at the cup. "I stopped because I couldn't make myself not stop. That's the whole reason." She considered that. "I'm glad you couldn't," she said. "So am I," he said, simply, without embellishment. Outside, the Montana evening was doing what Montana evenings did in autumn, coming on fast and cold and enormous, the sky going from gold to amber to a deep settled dark that had more stars in it than any sky she'd seen before coming here. Inside, the fire was burning, the coffee was hot, and the ledger on the table showed, in her own careful handwriting, the accounts of a ranch that was solvent and growing and built on ground that nobody had given her. She had earned every inch of it. Not the way the stories made earnings sound, clean and triumphant and leading inevitably forward to exactly this, but the actual way. The way that involved wrong turns and humiliation and real fear and the kind of exhaustion that gets into your bones and stays there, and the slow, undramatic daily work of deciding not to stop, even when stopping would have been completely understandable. She was 59 years old. Her hands showed it, and her face showed it, and her back, on the cold morning, showed it most of all. She was the person she had always been, opinionated and organized and not particularly good at accepting help gracefully and entirely capable of being wrong about things while being completely certain she was right. She was also, for the first time in her life, exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because it had been arranged that way, not because it had unfolded smoothly toward some predetermined conclusion, but because she had walked straight when she should have fallen and kept walking, and eventually the walking itself had brought her somewhere worth being. She closed the ledger, finished her coffee, and looked across the table at the man who had stopped his horse on a September afternoon because he couldn't make himself not stop. "It's getting late," she said. "It is," he agreed. Neither of them moved. The fire burned. The stars came out over Silver Creek. And the woman who had arrived in Montana territory with one suitcase and nowhere to go sat in the home she had built and felt, without drama and without qualification, the particular weight of a life that finally belonged entirely to her.